back to the channel. This project is something I've had in the works since February 2021. I started building this lathe bench slowly in my spare time, so I smashed a lot of it out in February, March, and then slowed down a bit as I got to some nitty-gritty parts. And then obviously we hit lockdown, and now end of the year I finished it off. So it does take over a bit of my spring shop storage challenge bench. The idea was to make this bench, but then during lockdown I decided to add drawers to my other workbench that I had my lathe on. But now I've got a brand new purpose-built lathe bench for my benchtop lathe. Very similar to some of the drawers I did in that workshop storage build. The drawers, I've got some more storage than that build, which is going to make it a lot more useful for me. So follow along on this journey of this year-long build. You'll see not all builds start off with an awesome CAD drawing. I started out with a 2D sketch of just what I wanted the front to look like, and you'll see what I came up with.
So the main feature of the bench is going to be these corner joins on each side. There's a bunch of half lap joins with some rebates and housings that are going to be held together with dowels for decorative and structural purposes. I got the idea from 3x3 Custom Tama in America, and she does a bunch of these crazy joins on her projects and they just look awesome, so I thought I'd have a crack at it. And a lot of the beginning part of this project was on the table saw, hogging out those rebates, those half lap joins. I originally was going to do this video in real time, but it ended up being about 30 minutes long, so I've decided to quicken it up a little bit. Now there's a lot of half lap joints to cut out here on the table saw. It would have taken me forever to cut them all out on the table saw, so I've just cutting some reliefs in, and then I'm going to tidy that up with my chisel later and get a nice flat surface for a glue up. So this section here is on the legs of the bench, and that's just a small rebate that's going to accept one of the half lap joints. And then I rotate at 90 and cut the same dimensioned rebate out on the other face to accept the other rail of the bench. The first major glue up was gluing the two side frames together, those half lap joints. As you can see, the bottom rail there that I'm gluing on now is a lot skinnier than the top rail. It didn't need to be as thick and chunky as the top rail, so I've decided to save space, and it's also rebated in from the bottom of the leg, so there's a bit of a gap from the bottom of the ground to the top rail where the bottom drawer will sit. And I've just glued those together, and later on I'll go through and you'll see I'll add dowels to those bits there to strengthen those lap joints. On those frames I opted for just one giant 25mm dowel instead of two smaller ones, you'll see I'd use the smaller dowels on the other side. So one thing I did off camera was rebate the base into the bottom rails and the center divider there. That's not actually glued together just yet, that's just clamped together. I've decided to do the rebate first and chisel out a spot for the base before I glue it, just so that helps keep everything square, and I wouldn't be able to get my router in if I did it later to rebate that base in and just to hide the end grain of the plywood. So here's the biggest glue up of the job. I also glued in some plywood panels into those sides off camera as well. They were rebated in from the back. So I've just dominoed those rails together for the bottom, and then I'm gluing the long rail supports to those sides that I did earlier. And what I've done some walnut stain on that panel there just to give it a contrast. I used plywood and I didn't want the plywood look to match the Tassie oak. I wanted to try something else, and I tried that walnut stain. This glue up was a bit of a stressful one. It took probably about 30 minutes to get it all in and lined up and square. I put in that base rail first, and I've painted those black. They were plywood as well. I used some India ink black paint, which I saw Tama again on 3x3 Customs use one time. I just got it from Amazon, and it just gives it a nice finish. That rail, I pre-drilled the dowels for those, so I didn't have to worry about lining them up. They were kind of pre-drilled, so then I could just re-drill through into the side panel and add those dowels in later. So that front rail there isn't actually glued on. I did that in a second stage. I just wanted to get the base into the sides, and the reason for that was there is a plywood divider down the middle of the bench to divide the drawers and the shelf section. So you can see I've rebated a slot there for the plywood divider to slide in there, and I had some birch plywood lying around. It's very nice grain, so I left that as is, and it's inside. No one's going to see it, so I didn't worry about staining that or anything. And it's just fixed from the back with some screws to hold it in, and the glue in that rebate housing is more than enough to hold it in place over time. I did pre-drill these holes first, but I needed to go through to the second part where the dowel is going to be glued into to secure it. And hello, need a new tripod. And I'm happy with how those dowels came out with that join. You can see it looks really distinguished and like a really nice piece of woodworking shop furniture, which is very unnecessary, but it's fun to do. One thing I did have to do was cover that birch plywood end grain on the front, and I had it matching with a Tassie oak strip just so it looked a lot better. Didn't have that ugly plywood edge showing. And there's my drawing, and that's what I got so far. It was about at this point where things started slowing down on this build, and it just sat there dormant for a few months, especially during lockdown. As we came out of lockdown, it was time to get back working on it. I smashed out all these drawers pretty quickly on the table saw with some housing joints and rebates and mounted them in. It's a very similar process to my other drawers that I did on my spring shop storage challenge, and I had to add my logo on the front of each drawer just for fun. This is the door part. I used some half lap joins again to match the rest of the build and some contrasting dowels. For the dowels, I used my plug cutters that I picked up and I drilled out some scrap walnut to try and match the walnut stain that I'm going to put on the front of that door and also on the sides of the panels. There it is there. I opted for 2 diagonal dowels in each lap joint to give it the strength it needs. I know plug cutters aren't traditional way of making dowels, but it was only about 19mm thick and the plug cutter was cleared that distance for me, and it meant I could use a dowel other than Tassie oak to contrast that timber. It's just a matter of rebating in that plywood backing and gluing it in. Like I said, I did stain it with a walnut stain to match those sides. I laser cut this shelving pin template to put my adjustable height shelving in, which is a pretty cool feature I thought. All the doors and drawers and wooden pieces a clear coat of water-based just to protect it over time. The last main component was doing the top. I used some form ply and some Tassie oak trim around it to cover those edges, and I dominoed that together. And it's just a matter of gluing it all together, and I made a relief in one of those sides for my workbench vise as well. And there's the relief for my bench vise in there. A small 45 chamfer on all the edges just to remove that sharpness from it. Now here's something I did in the Spring Shop Storage Challenge. These veneered drawer handles, and I'm trying a different mold this time and a different method. It's still a curve, but I remade the mold just to try and get a different sort of shape to it and see if that one would work better. One thing I did differently is I definitely alternate the grains. I bent it with the grain this time as opposed to last time I bent it along the grain, and it just bent I think too much this time, so it's not as strong as the original ones. And I'm using the Raw Rocket kit vac bag there just to glue it all down nice and even. And now I'm just cutting a rebate into the back of the bench for a piece of MDF backing to go in. It doesn't have to be pretty, it's going to be up against the wall, so MDF is going to work perfectly. And I'm continuing that 45 chamfer on the inside of those panels there. So after that clear coat, the last bit was to attach all the hardware. The drawer runners all worked fine. It was time to attach those handles and the hinges to the door with the catch as well. It's my first time using these tabletop clips. I just used the biscuit cutter to cut out a void 10mm down to wedge those into that slot and then screw it to the top from underneath, and worked pretty well. It's going to be nice and secure on there and allow for wood movement in the heat and cool temperatures that we get. It was very tricky to get into some of those tabletop clips from underneath. It wasn't the best spot to try and get them in. I picked up these workshop casters on Amazon, a 4-pack. They're pretty good. They let your bench sit flat on the ground, and you just engage the lever to pop the casters up or down. So the bench sits on the ground, not on casters like my old bench, and doesn't wobble around as much, especially when the lathe's moving. As you can see, they move around pretty smoothly, and I need this portability around my small workshop in the garage. So it's time to put all the drawers back in. They went back in pretty smoothly for the most part. Got that soft close again, which I love. It just gives it a nice feel to it. And putting that door in with the soft close as well. It's got a catch there with my shelf, which I also used that walnut stain to try and match it all together. I made myself a little bench hook as well to go with my new vise. So time to put it back in place. I had to rearrange a few things in here. The old baby bassinet miter saw station is going to get moved on and fixed up a bit. So my old bench will become a new miter saw station with my disc sander. It's finally time to move the lathe over onto the bench. See how it all goes together. And I did design it specially for my lathe. I gave it enough length to have some workspace as well on the sides and behind it, and to, I think, one day somehow incorporate the dust collection into it, because lathe dust is ridiculous. It was pretty convenient that the old drawers and the new drawers were pretty much the same size. I think it was about 10mm difference in length, so I just had to trim those dividers down ever so slightly to make it. So I've got my drawer set up very similar to the first workbench, with all my parts again laid out nicely. My other storage bits. I got one extra drawer this time for some bunch of random tools and stuff. And I got this compartment here for blanks and other random stuff I've got. Also put this small workbench vise in. It's rebaited in, so those drawers sit flush. Pretty cheap and nasty, just something to have. Thanks for following along on this build. It was a long journey, took a year. If you like what you saw, please head over to my Instagram and see some other things that I've been working on. And if you feel inclined, give it a subscribe and a thumbs up as well on my YouTube channel. Every little bit helps. So until next time, I'll see you later.